Sometimes a quick tip brings up another question, as it does in this request. This person was watching Quick Tip 276 called Why Block In, and she asked, would you consider doing a quick tip of the very next step here? In other words, the intermediary step before details. We can do that. You might want to watch our full-length video, which is free on YouTube, called Notan, How, and Why, which sort of goes through all the steps. But let me pick up now where the quick tip, what was it, 276, yes, where that quick tip leaves off. It's why block in. But I have to do a little something extra first. Your first step is always, after you have done the preliminary stuff, is a placement with a preliminary drawing, which is here. And my preference is to then switch gears, totally switch gears away from what it is to what is happening on it. What is the light doing? That is your first question. So what is the light doing? Where is the light located? And where are the light rays hitting? And where are they not hitting? And where they're not hitting is shadow. Where they are hitting is light. And that's what this is. This is a division of light and shadow, as we see here somewhat. If you squint, you can kind of see the little pattern of shadow here that is representing where you see shadow strongly falling in kind of an average here. It's simply shadow. It doesn't tell you anything about the degrees of values in those shadow. So that's what this is. Now I'm going to pick up and do the block in part that you saw in Quick Tip 276, but I'm not going to do the whole thing. I'm going to just do a portion, and that way you'll be able to see these 3 or 4 steps together. So to block in shadow, I'll just work right here in this area, which is represented by this area right in here. I always like to start with shadow, and I always like to start with a single value that represents the shadow when doing that block in part. So if I'm working right in here, then I would simply work right in here, and I may vary the value just a little bit on the block in. So we wouldn't be real careful in when we're just blocking in shadow. The main thing is that we're keeping the value as a shadow value, very dark. Now sometimes we can do this step and the next one I'm going to show you together, but if I break it down for you like this, perhaps that will make it a little bit clearer. So my values on my palette, I always like to put my colors out in a value line according to what I'm seeing right here. And I always think about this side as being the shadow side of the paint, and this side as being the light side of the paint, and this being the transition between shadow and light. So that then when I'm working in shadow, I'm working right over here. When I'm working in the areas in light or not in shadow, I'm working right over there. Now that's just a preliminary, that's just the way I set up my palette. It makes it easier to work, and it gives you a little bit more freedom so that you can get creative with the work. So I'll just put these in just as a block in, very loosely, not trying to be meticulous at all, but referring to this as I'm putting it in. So I'll just do this part right in here, like that, and you can see that is just very loosely blocked in as shadow. Alright, now I'm going to rinse the brush and block in the areas not in shadow. Now I like to block in those areas not in shadow a little bit darker, or in other words block them in kind of low light. So get that brush rinsed really well and dry it really well, get all of that solvent out. We don't need solvent in our paint. So I'll go into this area not in shadow. Now we see here, this is area where the light rays are hitting. So very generally, I'm not trying to define the whole thing. I'm not trying to define anything about leaves or trees or boughs or none of that stuff yet. I'm simply looking at where the light's hitting and indicating that here on the canvas. And I'm doing it in a darker value than I'm really seeing. So I might just do something like this to indicate where the light rays are hitting. That's all. That's all this does. Just says this is where light is hitting, and I pay attention to that pattern, and those light rays sometimes might be kind of inching down into the shadow areas like they are right in here. And so I just pay attention to that. This is where the light rays are hitting. This all this is saying. This is not saying anything else. This is where the light rays are hitting. So that's all this is. So that is a very simple approach to block in. So I can just loosely, just very loosely. I don't have to be meticulous about this. Just very loosely. This is where the light rays are hitting. So all this is saying. Now this would be the step that is block in. Now I can keep going, but I'm not going to because I want you to see the process as it happens here. This is where the person who made that request, this is where we pick up and put a little bit more about where the light rays are hitting right down in here. That would be this little section right in there. And so we'll just do a little bit more of that, take it just a little bit further. Now what do we do? What do you do when you get it blocked in? Then you begin to think, or not think, observe what's going on within the shadow areas and then what's going on with the light areas. Now, when we think only in terms of value, we're missing out. We don't see value without light and shadow. In the shadow areas, there's going to be a certain range of values. And that's what we do next. That is that next step before details. So in here, the photographs don't always show them, but when you're out in plein air painting, you will see them. But right in here, we have variations of values. There are, at the edge of those lights, we're going to see, even though the light rays are not hitting, we'll see some reflected light going down, and we might have 3 degrees of shadow. All right, so what we might do there is I'll move from the transition value just very slightly over into the shadow value, get that just about 1 step darker, and I might want to cool it just a little bit since it's in the shadow area. I might want to neutralize it a little bit more since it's in the shadow area. And I'll begin to work smaller. I'm working with a smaller part of the brush this time, and just differentiate that is a lighter shadow in this area. That is a lighter shadow. That is the next step past block in. Now you can do this step while you're doing block in. You can do the block in and the differentiation of values at the same time, but I wanted to break it down into this kind of step-by-step process so that you can see that. You can actually see it happening. And here we begin to see some shadows moving in. You can see them within those little light areas. So we can indicate that, but we indicate that not with the darkest dark, but we indicate that with the transition. That dark, that value, which is just between shadow and light, you might call it. So I'm not going to call it by any value number. This is left to your observation to do that. So we'll make that differentiation. And we still have here the darkest dark, which we always reserve for those deep, deep, deep shadows. All right, so I would continue working these all through the shadow areas. It's a good idea. I like. You may have your own way of working, but I find that the more organized you are in your pattern of working, the better work you do. Where you know what you're doing. I know what I'm doing now. I'm defining the variations of value within shadow areas. And so I'm focusing right over in here to see those variations, and I can see some very shallow shadow areas popping out of the light there, and then I would do that. Get those, and then watch the angle at which those are turned, very shallow shadow areas popping out of the light. And this is when the thing begins to fall into place. When it will begin to look like, if you will, what you're painting. So I can go up in here and I look for those shallow shadow areas. It's going that next step from general to a little bit more specific. So I get the shallow shadow areas right in here. Now I do have a quick tip, 250, called The Anatomy of Light, that you can go to, where I break down the whole anatomy of light and shadow and show you those varying degrees of what happens to values when the lights are hitting directly and when the lights are not hitting quite so strong, and what happens in shadows when they are moving deeper away from the light and when they're closer to the lights. So this I would carry forward. Now once I have defined or indicated, let's say it that way, once I have indicated variations of value in shadow, variations I see, and also those shallow shadows that will pop through light. And you won't always see those, it depends upon the subject you're working with, but this principle could apply to any subject you're working with. Then I go into the areas of light and I do the same process, where now I'm trying to find those variations of values within the light. Where the light's hitting the strongest is the lightest. Where the light is not hitting quite so strong is darker. So let's see how we would do that. Now I move on my value scale, I move over into this section. Now I'm seeing that may be just a little bit intense for that particular area. In that case, well, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to pick up a little bit of a complement. In this case, this is transparent oxide red. I'm going to add just enough white into it to get it closer to this value right here. And a little bit more. And now normally I would build a value line of that too, so that I have the same value here. But this is an alternate way to do it. But whenever you're going to add a color, another color into a light color, you need to value correct it first. That means you need to change this value to be the same value or a similar value as the value you're working with. So I don't need cool there. I just need it to be a little less intense. And so I will now load the brush with this in more intense color. I'll pull it just to the edge so I can control it. And let's get a little bit lighter, or a little bit less intense. And let's see what happens. Now we're in the light area. This is in this. And I'm just building this towards where the light would be shining. Or I'm going to pull a little bit more. Let's pull a little bit more white right over here. We'll just pull that white down right here so that we can control that. So we're defining light now, defining what light is doing. We see the light is moving, well, it's moving in this direction, and we see kind of a counter movement there. So I will go right up in here and begin to apply that light, get a little lighter, and even a little lighter. And you can see it's easier to lighten a dark than it is to darken a light. So that's the reason I like to put the darker version of that, where that light area is, I like to put that on first so I can work into it. And by working into it, then I can change the value as well. So let's make that really, see, as the sun's hitting, we can tell the brightest part is about right up in here. So on this particular bow, the brightest part is right in here, right next to that shadow area. Let's get that even lighter. How light can we get that and still represent? And so the lighter, the small, and on this particular tree, what I'm seeing, the lighter portions are smaller. The light is not hitting the same degree of strength on the whole tree. All right, now let's see, it's come down. We've got another set of boughs right here. Now we can hit that light a little stronger. So all we're doing there is defining light. That's all. The degree of light that we're seeing and what it's doing. You don't want to overdo that, because we can see those really light lights are smaller amounts. Do we see any of that real light right up here? Not much at all. So I'm going to lower the value and do just a little bit of differentiation here. You see that's just a little bit darker. This is away from the bright light. The center light is not really hitting here. There may be one or two little leaves popping out. There we go, something like that. That would show that. But that's all we need. So we don't want to overdo. In other words, you don't do the same amount of value differences in any one area. You use your subject as your guide, and where you see the values lighter, you make them lighter. Where you see them a little darker, you make them a little darker. So that's pretty much what you do as that second step. Now I might move back here. Now that I've done the light, I might see a little bit more variation right here in this shadow. So you can move back and forth and distinguish variations, like right in here. That's really deep right there as the photograph shows it, but as I'm seeing it, I might see those shadows just a little bit more well, have more variation in them. Now this is what the viewer asked for, is this intermediate step. In this intermediate step, you are finding differences in values within the shadow areas, within the light areas, which I just showed you. 9 times out of 10, that's going to be also showing you details. But if it's not, this is the place where you then go in and refine your little details. Now the person didn't ask for that, but what you start looking for now are other textures, texture variations, where there might be little tiny bits of light there that are showing more variation than we showed right here, for example. So the details always come last. If you try to start out with details, you're going to find yourself pretty baffled, because those details need something to be detailed upon, and you're not going to have something to detail them upon if you don't have that foundation first. This is the way nature appears to us when lights and shadows well, let's say this, when there's a direct light source like there is here, we see them more pronounced, those lights and shadows. When there's an indirect light source, we see them less pronounced, but we still have lights and shadows, and we see the details in there because of those lights and shadows. And then we just keep getting it smaller and smaller. Within larger areas, we find smaller areas of value of variation, and that helps to create textures when you need it. You see, kind of see what I'm doing here. Only here would I begin to add limbs. Well, I say only here. This would be a good place to begin to add limbs and trunks, but that's details. So I hope I answered that question of that next step. Okay, I see another little another little variation in here. You never get them all at the first try. The more you look, the more you're going to see little value variations. The main thing is to get them the value they would be if they're in shadow, and the value they would be if they're in light, and you get your information from that right there. So I hope that answers that question, and then lets you know a process that you can use to make painting logical, at the same time creative. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianeMize.com, where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.